There's this term in poker, pot committed. I'll tell you how and why I know it another time, but depending on how strong your hand is, it can mean either throwing good money after bad or sticking with something you're fairly certain will pay off. And pot committed is how I describe my attitude towards this podcast generally, but especially this episode specifically. Every decision I make about how, what, when, where, why to record relies a little bit on what will I get out of this? What will my audience, clients, cohorts get out of it? And if it's more than what I'm putting in, I'm in. So thank God I am pot committed to how I know this episode will pay off for everyone involved, you included, because otherwise we would not be here together right now. As I speak, this is the second time that I am recording this episode because the first one was obliterated by the technical difficulties that follow me around and taunt me like the mean boy on the playground that everybody said was doing it because they like you. Thanks. I'd rather the technical gremlins find a new crush, but I'm investing the additional, 30 minutes because I've done the mental math on how having this episode out in the world will pay off for me. And I'd like to thank you too. And the chips we rake in are well worth the time. See, there's this one exact sentence that I've been obsessed with this week, and that is, your podcast should be the hardest working, highest ROI asset in your business. And I'm obsessed with it because it crystallized rather succinctly what I know to be true. And because I spent, shall we say, a lot of pod committed time this week overhauling the messaging on my website. Feel free to check it out at soundsgreatstrategy.com. And that deserves a little extra return on thinking too. So it's getting a little moment in the sun here. And it's also relevant. My homepage copy says, you work hard, your podcast should work harder. This week, I have worked hard. I've been working probably too hard for a while. And so it's time for my podcast to step in and do its part, which is why I'm here on a Saturday. Don't worry, the kids are at sleepaway camp, dogs with my husband. Obviously, I enjoy doing this. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. But also, I was almost not going to do it at all. Why am I telling you this? Because as painful as it was to wake up bright-eyed and bushy-tailed this morning, ready to review the episode that I thought I recorded last night, only to find an empty file where the recording should be, it gave me a chance to try out some of my own advice, which is the whole point of this podcast, talking the talk, walking the walk. My whole philosophy around podcasting and business can be summed up in several well-worn phrases I spout everywhere. Here are a few standouts. Your podcast should help you build without burnout, build systems and content flywheels that support you, not the other way around. And yes, your podcast should work harder than you do. Another one I pull out often is when you feel like you're about to pod fade out, look for easy mode. Or when you're having trouble even getting started because of all of, frankly, even some of the overwhelming advice that I spew at times, look for the easy mode. It's like the great Mr. Rogers quote, but instead of look for the helpers, look for what will help you make your podcast. It's look for the path of least podcast resistance. So as I was facing the empty space where this solo episode recording should be today, instead of saying F it and taking the L, I said, what would Courtney tell her clients to do? I know it's a little psychologically unsound to refer to yourself by your first name in the third person. Don't at me. It's how I manage to be my own podcast strategy advisor. It helps me see if my own advice actually works before I continue espousing it and, building a business on it. In tech, they call it eating your own dog food, but really it is for the good of the clients and cohorts that I walk the walk and not only talk the talk, continually seeing how I can iterate on it, make it better for them and for me. The content that comes out of all this is just icing. So as this week was getting away from me, I thought, I'll do one of those voice note episodes that I'm always raving about. I am gushing at all times to everyone who's just beleaguered by the mere notion of having to make a podcast. I say, hey, do you send voice notes to your friends? Do they send them to you? What kind of equipment does that require? Because again, first question is always, what mic should I get? And something just happens to their brain when that question comes up. Pick your meme of the always sunny guy or that woman with all of the calculus, physics equations. So I just say, pick up your phone, record a voice memo. If you have an episode idea, record it, text it to me. I'll let you know how it sounds. So I said, okay, let me do what I'm always telling people to do when they don't feel like they have the wherewithal or any gas in their tank to put into an episode this week. A voice note is perfect for when you don't feel like showing up on camera and don't have the guest or gumption you thought you were going to have when imagining your next episode. It's better to show up in the smaller container of a voice note episode than not show up at all. Also, the shorter voice note episodes are remarkably effective in building that parasocial relationship with your audience because they are almost identical to the actual social interactions people are having in their real lives. Not that podcasting isn't real life, but you get what I mean. If you're wondering what it is I'm actually talking about, it's literally just like a voice note you've probably received sometime somewhere from someone who prefers to communicate with their voice rather than typing into a text message bubble. As for me, I said, I'm feeling kind of tapped out. I'll just do a voice note episode. And then I thought, well, shoot, why not just turn on the camera and the ring light too? Got a decent enough shirt on, even put on some lipstick. Might as well get more mileage out of that too. But honestly, it wasn't just the window dressing that sold me on showing up here today. It was, how can I get a bigger return on the thinking and the time that I'll put into it so that this episode works harder than I do? I started to do that mental flywheel catalog that if you've been in my presence or listened to one of these before or watched, you will recognize if you've been in my presence in some form or another. I started thinking, okay, this episode could deliver and will deliver short video that has multiple lives across multiple channels, Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts, LinkedIn though. For LinkedIn, I'll probably just use something from the transcript, maybe make a carousel, some sort of text post, because is it just me or is LinkedIn suddenly pivoting away from video again? It'll also give me a transcript that I can plop into my LLM of choice because it can sometimes pull out a theme I might not have caught because I'm too caught up in my own head. This episode can also become a great show don't tell example for my clients and cohorts who are certain a podcast entails all bells and whistles and beautiful sets and documentarian camera people. This is proof that there is a minimum viable path to getting an episode out. I almost want to show you the bare feet that I have while I'm doing it. It's a choice. Anyway, it's also an illustration of why it's important to have a quick turnaround solo episode format in your podcast bag of tricks when things don't go as planned. And let's be honest, it's also a great place for prospective clients and cohort members to get to know me and my expertise and my not conventional way of showing up in the world. Just this week, I sent to a prospective member of my newly reimagined podcast launch cohort program an episode that I put out a few months ago because that episode spoke to a central concern he's grappling with as he's thinking about his podcast. It felt like a pre-wrapped gift that I could, mere moments after we hung up from a discovery call, go to my podcast and pluck out and send to him to serve as further elaboration on a point that I was making on that call. All of this to say, anytime you or I start thinking about the podcast as a time-sucking deliverable or obligation, it's time to turn that frown upside down and flip that thinking to, if I decide to work on an episode, how can it work harder for me? How can I get a higher ROI and a higher return on thinking of what I put into the podcast? In this case, I had given myself permission to just pull out my phone, monologue casually about the thoughts that had come up on my walk with my dog that I had just dumped voice typed into a Google Doc. And then I remembered this hot take that I have on the yapping trend. If you haven't seen all the fuss about yapping on Instagram, it's basically this hot new way of making Instagram Reels that is basically podcasting. One woman has literally made millions off of it, teaching people how to do it. I mean, shout out to you, Jessie Jean. Literal millions of dollars in 2 months? And shout out to my Yap Challenge people who are taking her up on it. But I gotta say, they're basically a shorter version of this solo episode you're tuned into right now. But okay, if you're doing the Yap Challenge and you know something I don't, maybe we could swap a little podcast strategy session and you could teach me what you've learned about yapping. I digress a bit. I did decide to record this episode because I thought, okay, well, there's at least one yapping video that my podcast software, either Descript or Riverside, could probably pull out for me once I've recorded this. Which again, remember, my return on time KPI is what else will this episode make possible? Not also what will it make, but also what will it make possible? What do I sacrifice by not doing it? Leaving aside the unlikely scenario of my followers checking their watches and wondering if I've ghosted them, I do still want a newsletter this week. And what would that newsletter be about? Because I usually use my podcast as the jumping off point for my newsletter. And I thought, I'm already starting down this path of thinking about my newsletter. I might as well think about the podcast episode, which will help me think less about my newsletter, frankly. I stopped myself and I said, Courtney, remember, return on thinking, think once, generate multiple times. So up to the mic, I have stepped. And yes, stepped. I like to stand while I record. This is also me walking the walk following an epic light bulb moment that came up in a brainstorm planning session about a workshop I'll soon be leading for my local entrepreneur group, Bigwig, who clearly I love enough that they have merited a space. This is for you audio only people, my people. I am motioning to a Bigwig little notepad that I have on my bookshelf. Anyway, this meeting was with the wonderful Ricky Goldenberg, who is head of curriculum for Bigwig. She floated the idea one of her fellow Bigwig board members had, which was for me to talk about how to land a guest spot on a podcast, or how, the best practices or how to land a podcast guesting spot. I get it. It's much easier to wrap your head around the value of a podcast guest spot. And it's also why there's that whole cottage industry dedicated to getting people on billions of podcasts with varying degrees of snake oil involved, I might add. Bless Ricky, as a graduate of one of my founding podcast launch cohorts, she told them one of the statistics I shared about how there are 41 hopeful podcast guests for every one podcast host. And that's just on Podmatch. But this ratio is a microcosm of how out of whack the supply and demand of guests to podcast hosts is. So we danced around that idea for a while until, wait, it clicked. What if instead of simply teaching people how to get booked on podcasts, what if they all came on my podcast? Stick with me. I know it sounds like I'm once again overcommitting and getting overexcited with my appetite for ideas being bigger than my capacity. But it is really one of those win-win situations that podcasting is legendary for. I've said countless times to clients and cohorts, even casual acquaintances, I'm not just like this on my podcast. I'm always talking about this stuff. What I say is anytime you're speaking publicly, you are creating potential podcast content. I have dedicated significant portions of my cohort Q&A to explaining how webinars and workshops are podcast episodes hiding in plain sight. But have I yet walked the walk on my own advice for that? No, ma'am, no, sir, I have not. So thank God my own voice creeped into my head because I was like, holy shit, if we make this workshop do triple duty and have it be part teaching how to show up on a podcast, your own or someone else's, part putting those teachings to work in a live podcast recording for my show, and then pairing off with other folks to try out what was just shown and told how to do, watching both me and a guest in real time, everyone walks away with a valuable artifact in the form of podcast content and the knowledge that they gained in the process. And for me, let's be real, the business owner and the podcaster at the center of this, that hour spent leading a workshop is more than just an hour leading a workshop and the honorarium I'll get for doing it. I now walk away with material for a podcast episode, the social content that will beget, or even people being there taking pictures of it happening, visibility with my ideal audience, future episode ideas that come up that do whenever you're mixing around in those kinds of situations. And honestly, the utter delight of knowing that those in attendance didn't just receive ephemeral, kind of meaningless tidbits that float in and then float out of their head. They got to actually act on the information that I'll be sharing with them there. And when my podcast episode comes out, they'll get that bonus flywheel material and to say, look, I am on that podcast episode. I guested on that podcast episode. The workshop becomes the podcast, which becomes an asset for those who came and who showed up on my episode in that workshop, which also becomes great word of mouth for this show and for my business. And who knows, maybe some new recruits to my new program launching this fall. More to come on that. And it's also a beautiful illustration of how it is truly a flywheel, not just a conveyor belt. We tend to think of this flywheel scenario of like, record a podcast episode, turn it into clips or a post the clips, start over. If you think about a true and truly magical flywheel that a podcast can be, that wheel is picking up new fuel as it generates energy and assets. You've heard me say a million times that a podcast generates newsletters, client conversations, LinkedIn posts, new relationships. But the podcast isn't just a magically replenishing well of goodness, just poof, a new idea, new material comes out. Sometimes that flywheel needs to pick up material in the form of, say, a workshop that you're leading, and that becomes an episode, or a client question sparks an episode, which becomes a newsletter, which elicits a reply, which becomes a discovery call, which could then become an introduction to a prior podcast guest who might be a better fit for that prospect, and you get the idea. Nothing exists in isolation. Everything has multiple uses. I am not a single serving kind of entrepreneur, and you don't have to be either. I'm so glad I finally took my own advice again this week. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here right now and once again discovering a new form of podcast magic. If the overwhelm and the sense that a podcast would only be additive to your workload, not additive to your business, your growth, or your relationships, think again. I certainly had to think twice this week. But if you're still in that endless loop of should I, shouldn't I, we really should talk, and not just me talking at you on this podcast. Go to my newly refurbished website, soundsgreatstrategy.com, and click that Book a Podcast Clarity Call button that's right there in deep burgundy staring at you when you land there. And we'll be off to the races. I look forward to it. This is Talking the Talk, a podcast about podcasting. I am Courtney Reimer. Keep listening, keep watching, keep learning, and keep remembering there's almost always an easy mode, and you should take advantage of it whenever you need to. I am certainly glad I did.